Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. We're not in our usual place. We're in my day job, Yeshivat Or Sameach, and I want to thank Rabbi Poston and everyone else to schlep out and make a special trip. Tonight's shir is dedicated for a Refua Shlema. To all Chaya Yisrael, and of course all of those who are suffering as a result of the war that we're going through. And an Aliyat Neshamot of Rabbi Moshe Fishel ben Rav Mishael and Devorah bas Sarah Finkelstein. Again, I've mentioned before that Rabbi Finkelstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was a very formative influence in my own life growing up in Hartford, and I'm certainly very, very honored to give a shir le'ilei nishmato. In addition to David Moshe Ben Avraham Fishel and the brother Yonatan Yisrael ben David Moshe by Chaya Feingold and Shula bat Miriam, and Mrs. Judy Greenwald dedicates the shir in memory of Eliyahu Dov Ben Avraham, HaRav Dov Aryeh Ben Avraham Yehuda, Sima Breina bas Elchonen, and Mishael ben HaRav Dov Aryeh. Again, may all of the learning be le'ilei neshama of all of these people. And from Rav Naftali Reich, in gratitude to Rabbi Breitowitz, and in memory of Eliezer ben Shmuel, Rabbi Breitowitz's guidance to us and to the attending physicians through Eliezer ben Shmuel's final days was invaluable and unforgettable. Once again, it should be le'ilei nishmatam. As all of you know, we're going through a very, very difficult time right now. And I know that some people here were happen to be visiting Eretz Yisrael for Sukkot, and you happen to be here when a war broke out. And although I recognize how frightening this would be, and all of us are frightened and all of us are disturbed, but nevertheless, on some level, you do have to understand it actually is a privilege to be with the Jewish people in their land in this time of distress, in this time of tzara, in which you can join us in going through the struggles that we are going through, and your prayers will be added to our prayers to open the gates of heaven and bring down the mercy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we desperately need. And of course, I also want to say that we're all extremely grateful to the people even who aren't in Israel, who I know feel our pain, feel our suffering in many, many ways. Our pain, our suffering is their pain and their suffering. And I know firsthand how many tefillos they're offering, how much tzedakah that they're giving. And may the collective zechus of the people here and the people there throughout the world, Yidden come together. May it be a great, great merit for Am Yisrael to bring a Yeshua and a Geulah from the tremendous struggle that we are presently facing. You know, there's a well-known vort which had the events not unfolded as they would have unfolded, I was going to say, and I'm going to say it, but just to indicate ahead of time that it's actually not that relevant for the situation we're facing. And that is, people point out that we are approaching Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. We are approaching Rosh Chodesh, the second month of the year. And Cheshvan is often called Mar Cheshvan, the bitter month of Cheshvan. And the common reason that's given is it's the one month of the year that does not have any special holidays. Tishrei is full of holidays, and Kislev has Chanukah, and Teves has Chanukah, and Shvat has Tu B'Shvat, although we're stretching the definition of holidays a little bit. Adar has Purim, and Nisan has Pesach, and Iyar has Pesach Sheni and Yom Ha'atzmaut. Again, we're Lag BaOmer, again stretching it, but still there's some festive day. And then Tammuz. Well, Tammuz has the 17th of Tammuz, but Chazal say when Mashiach comes, that's going to be a day of rejoicing. Av has the 9th of Av, which although it's a sad day, is the day that Mashiach is born, and that will also be a Yom Tov, and of course the 15th of Av, which is a great holiday. Elul has no holidays per se, but it's preliminary to all of the holidays of Tishrei. But Cheshvan is bereft. Cheshvan is ordinary. Cheshvan is not special. And as a result, after all of the Chagim, there's a certain sense of a downer, of no longer having anything to be excited about. But a thought that I often communicated was that Cheshvan is the litmus test of what we gained from the high holidays. Meaning, we had the holidays of reflection and repentance and prayer. We have the holidays of joy. But the real test of a Yom Tov is not so much how you experience it at the time, but whether it carries over into an inspiration that will lift you up through the year. So right after 3 or 4 weeks of very, very intense holiness and sanctity, Hashem puts us into a normal environment to see if we have truly grown from the Yomim Tovim. The Chazon Ish used to give a mashal that if you have a pot and the pot overflows because it's boiling, well, as long as the pot is on the fire, you don't really know how full it is. Even a half-empty pot will boil over when it's on the fire. So how do you know how much the pot really has? When it's off the fire and there's no fire and it's not hot, if it still overflows, then you know it's full. If it doesn't overflow, you know it's not. It's partially empty. So too, the fact that I'm excited and inspired in the middle of a Chag does not indicate at all that I've been transformed. It's precisely in the ordinariness of Cheshvan that we have the real test of the Yomim Tovim. So it's a theme that I've talked about quite a lot, and that is we go from the sacred and special to the ordinary and boring to indicate to God that we truly have absorbed the lessons of holiness and we bring them into ordinary life. That is a thought that I think is very relevant in most years. This year, however, things have taken a different turn. As we leave the month of Tishrei and we enter the month of Cheshvan, it's no longer leaving the special and going into the ordinary and mundane, but rather we've been immediately plunged into extraordinary circumstances. Circumstances that call upon us to bring out strengths and courage that we otherwise didn't know that we were capable of. The existential struggle that the Jewish people face in their land is perhaps unparalleled for the entire existence of the State of Israel. I mean, since 1948, this perhaps has been the biggest struggle that we faced. And although Baruch Hashem, I have to say that in most of the country, including Yerushalayim, and may it continue to be so, there seems to be relative stability. Walk outside, life is going on. But we cannot be oblivious to the cost and the suffering that is happening down south and to a lesser degree, even up north, in which soldiers, thousands of soldiers have already given their lives. They've been injured. Hostages have been captured under brutal conditions. And if, as seems probable, there will have to be a ground invasion of that hellhole of evil called Gaza, then unfortunately the sakana, both to our chayalim and to our hostages, brothers and sisters, is greatly, greatly, greatly increased. So the fact that God in His mercy allows most of Israel to function in a relatively normal way should not obscure the fact that there is tremendous pain and suffering. And it's our sacred responsibility to feel that pain, to pray, to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, if in most years the transition from the Chagim was a transition from special time to ordinary time, which is also ultimately special, this is a different type of transition. And in some ways, God is giving us another test. Have we absorbed the lessons of the Chagim as we face the tremendous, tremendous challenges that have been put into our way precisely at the crescendo of the happiest day of the year, the day of Simchat Torah, the day where we were dancing with the Torah, we were rejoicing with the Torah. And that very day, this happened. So there was a lot to think about. You know, people call me up. Everybody wants, from me and really from every rabbi, words of chizuk, words of encouragement, words of strength. And the truth of the matter is, I find it very difficult myself to come up with words. On one level, the messages are kind of straightforward. After all, for the past 7 weeks, the month of Elul, and the Rosh Hashanah, and Aseret Yemei Tshuva, and Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres, and Hoshana Rabbah, and Shmini Atzeres, and Simchas Torah. We've been talking about the need of tshuva, the need of Avat Yisrael, the need to grow, the need to become better in so many ways. So what's the message now? The message now is the same message. It's a message that we've been hearing over and over and over again from one rabbi, from other rabbis. Really, everyone is giving the same message. And now, it reminds me a little bit of an old Chabad story where a chassid went to one of the rebbes, not the last rebbe, but I think the Rebbe Rashab, and said, we've been through Rosh Hashanah and Aseret Yemei Tshuva and Yom Kippur and Sukkot. What do we do now? What is our avoda now? So the Rebbe Rashab said, now the avoda is to do tshuva, not just talk about it, but to actually do it. Now is not the time for talking. Now is the time for action. So in many, many ways, I find it a little difficult to talk about the same things that we've been talking about. It's time to do it and not just talk about it. So there are really 2 points that I want to talk about a little bit. And the 2 points are not necessarily connected, but they're 2 different aspects of the struggle that we're facing. The first, of which I am actually less qualified to talk about, but I think it needs to be mentioned a little bit, are some of the very frightening messianic aspects of this particular struggle, particularly during this time of year. If you remember the Haftarah from the first day of Sukkot, it is taken from chapter 14 of the Navi Zechariah. And Zechariah was one of the very last prophets at the beginning of the Second Temple period. And a lot of Zechariah's prophecies pertain to Mashiach, the apocalyptic struggles before the Mashiach comes, the wars of GoG and MaGoG, etc. And in chapter 14, he describes the wars of GoG and MaGoG, and he describes attacks against Jerusalem, and certainly against the land of Israel, in very, very graphic and striking detail. And there is a tradition that this is connected to the holiday of Sukkot, that Sukkot is the time of the wars of GoG and MaGoG. Now, GoG and MaGoG, although they are identified as nations, we don't really know who they are. There's all sorts of identifications, ranging from Russia, Ukraine, to Arab nations, to many nations in between. Of course, we have Russia, Ukraine, and the Arab nations, and the like. And Maral adds to the mix a very intriguing idea that the final exile will be a combination of Yishmael, which are the Arab nations, and Persia, which is modern-day Iran. And there will be a collaboration between Paras and Yishmael that will put the Jewish people at very, very great peril until the Mashiach will finally come. And that is connected to Sukkot. So although the Rambam warns us that we really do not know the details of GoG and MaGoG, we don't know the details of Chavlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach. We will only understand these things in retrospect, in hindsight. When everything happens, when Mashiach comes, we'll then be able to identify the different stages. But to try to identify those stages as they're happening is really beyond our comprehension. But certainly we have intimations that this is part of the GoG and MaGoG struggle, especially without getting into details of politics too much, when you consider that this Hamas terrorism was probably sponsored by Iran based on $6 billion that the United States made available to Iran. Again, that's a contested argument, but there's some basis for it. And once again, is that not what the Maharal told us hundreds and hundreds of years ago? That the final pre-Messianic confrontation will be a collaboration, an unhealthy collaboration between Paras, Iran, and Ishmael, the Arab. Remember, Iranians are Muslims, but they're not Arabs. They're considered to be Paras, Persia, and Ishmael are considered to be the Arab nations. So the notion of GoG and MaGoG is something that is both very frightening and very comforting at the same time. It's very frightening because that does indicate that there may be a long and difficult struggle ahead of us, and it may be filled with dangers and risks, sakanot, and fear. Comforting, however, because it is the birth pains of Mashiach. Note the analogy of birth pains. It's a very, very, very evocative phrase. A woman goes into labor. There's excruciating suffering. Before there was anesthesia, certainly that was the case. But out of that suffering comes life, comes growth, comes something new and beautiful. So too, the Messianic process is like a birth process. There is pain, there is suffering. But out of that suffering will come light and redemption and goodness. Maharal points out that there's another metaphor that we use when we describe the Messianic era, and that is the sprouting of a seed. We say in the Amidah, Es Samach David. Samach is a growth. The seed of David will generate. So, if the metaphor of birth connotes the pain that precedes birth, and that connects to the Chavlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach, the notion of seed has a slightly different connotation, although it's related. Maharal says the connotation of a seed is that a seed totally disintegrates into the ground before a plant arises. I plant a seed. If you could watch the seed through an X-ray or whatever it would be, you would actually see a seed disintegrating into the soil and then something coming together. So Maharal says, Mashiach cannot come as long as we are consumed with our egotism, our sense of control, our sense that we are in charge of our fate. Man, or the Jewish people, has to reach a state in which they feel helpless, in which they feel their situation is beyond their control, that only God can help them. Of course, we have to do our part. We need, Baruch Hashem, an army, and we're so proud and grateful to all that the army is doing in this difficult time, 100%. But we also have to know that without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can't do it. It's the obliteration of our egotism that ultimately is our disintegration that allows the Messianic redemption to come. So the two metaphors are very important. The Biat HaMashiach, the Geula, is described as a birthing process, and is described as the germination of a seed process. One is the pain and the struggle, and the other is the obliteration of ego. Again, I don't want to get too political about this. I just want to point out that one of the things that is surprising everybody, including the Israeli government, is how could there have been such a massive intelligence failure? One of the great strengths of our system is that our guys know what's going on in Gaza and every part of the land, the intelligence all over the world. that Israel is almost never caught by surprise. In fact, it's been said that for every successful terrorist event, the police or the army or the Shin Bet, they manage to frustrate 20. It's like a ratio of 20 to 1. Quite amazing. We hear about a terrorist event, we get very upset. There were 20 others that they managed to nip in the bud. This was a total surprise. And it's very, very strange. Ad kedei kach that I'm even hearing Americans, I think it's unconscionable, critical of Israel, like somehow, it's kind of perverse. It's somehow Israel's fault that they didn't catch on to this. Talk about blaming the victim. But still, it's very, very surprising. But part of what's going on is that we have to learn sometimes that we're not in charge. And when we get too filled with our own sense of control of the world, God shows us we're not in control. In some ways, that was the lesson of Corona, which, thank God, we're more or less past. And that's also the lesson of Gaza and Hamas, Simchas Torah, 5784. But, as the Maral says, once we get our egos out of the way, then we're ready for Geula, then we're ready for Mashiach. So, as I say, as I contemplate the Messianic picture, and again, this is not anything that I can say I have any firm grasp on, really none of us have, except maybe the greatest Kabbalists, I'm filled with both fear and trepidation, but also with opportunity and hope, because these are the signs of Biat HaMashiach, these are the signs of Chavlei Mashiach, these are the signs of GoG MaGoG, and indeed even the time of year fits the description in the Navi Zechariah. So there is hope, there is a reason to be hopeful, and B'ezrat Hashem we should see the Yeshuat Hashem very, very soon. Let me go back a little bit. I didn't have a chance actually before Sukkot to talk about Sukkot. But since so much of Sukkot is connected to GoG and MaGoG, I'm going to go back a little bit and draw some connections, and you'll see how all of this ties in to the great struggle that we are facing. Sukkot is a very unusual holiday. In the time of the temple, there is a Musaf offering, an additional offering that was brought. We bring it on Shabbos, we bring it on Rosh Chodesh, we bring it on every holiday, including Chol HaMoed. But Sukkot has a very unusual Musaf configuration. Number one, the number of animals you bring is by far much larger than any other holiday. And number two, they are brought in a descending order. Meaning on the first day of Sukkot, we brought 13 bulls as burnt offerings. And then we went down, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. That's Hoshana Rabbah. In other words, Shmini Atzeret is a different holiday. But for the 7 days of Sukkot, we brought the Parei HaChag, the bulls of Sukkot, in descending order. And Chazal added up the digits, and if you add up all of the parim, you come up with the number of 70. So we brought a total of 70 bulls on Sukkot, going down in descending order. Chazal teach us that the 70 bulls represent 70 nations of the world. Now those nations are descended from the 3 sons of Noach, and they are enumerated in Parshat Noach. Now obviously there are more than 70 countries in the world. The United Nations has whatever number it has, over 100 members, but those are breakaways. But according to our tradition, there are 70 basic national groups, and each of them has their own destiny, their own personality. That itself is a very fascinating issue. Do we believe in collectivist national personality? We tend to think in modern times that every individual is their own person, and to some degree that is true. Not every German is a Nazi, for example, but nevertheless there is a certain national identity that exists. And these 70 nations, by and large, try to destroy us in various ways. And the notion of the Parei HaChag is we bring korbanot to diminish their power as we approach the Messianic era. So these are korbanot to weaken their evil influences. And since Sukkot is, in a sense, a reenactment of GoG and MaGoG, so we actually ritualize that through the bringing of the korbanot of the 70 nations. Now it's interesting, there's another take on it in the Gemara, where the Gemara actually says that the korbanot of Sukkot are korbanot for the blessing of the 70 nations. We're asking God to bless the nations. Now, in fact, the Talmud even makes the amazing statement that if the nations of the world would be aware of how much blessing we brought to them, they never would have destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. So we have two different aspects here. Are we bringing korbanot to be protected from them, against them? Are we bringing korbanot for them? And of course, if it's for them, you're going to have the problem, why are they diminishing in time? I mean, that doesn't explain that aspect of it. But in truth, I would suggest that these are not contradictory perspectives. We want their evil to be diminished. But we don't necessarily want them to be physically destroyed. We want them too to do tshuva, to turn to God, to embrace goodness and morality, and then they too will be worthy of God's blessing. And the Beit HaMikdash will be, as the Navi Yeshayahu said, and we said this many times in the Slichos, Ki beiti beit tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. My house, God says, my house shall be a house of prayer for all the nations of the world. So yes, we bring korbanot to diminish their evil. And then, when they forsake their evil ways, may God bless them. Now, it's a little strange, because in some ways we've had starts and setbacks. The Abrahamic Accords, some might view this as a step in the direction of tshuva, although maybe it was economically motivated, in the sense of opening up the ability of Jews to have a relationship with some of these countries, to live there, to have synagogues, kosher restaurants, and the like. And then we have this, which is the opposite. It just shows you that when there's movement for good, there will often be counter movements for bad. Right? The world exists with this eternal struggle of good and evil. And the Parei HaChag does represent the idea that eventually this evil will be conquered. And not just physically destroyed, but the other way around, will be transformed into things that might be positive forces for good. Ki beisi beit tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. We don't pray for the death of the evildoers. We pray for the death of the evil that they do. Now, if that means an individual has to be killed, then so be it. As sad and as tragic as that is. Haba l'hargecha, someone who is coming to kill you or kill your people. Hashkein v'harigla, we kill. We don't turn the other cheek. We don't believe in pacifism as an absolute value. We do what we have to do. I want to make it very, very clear that we can't accept appeasement. But I also want to make it clear that what might become necessary as a short-term objective is not, in essence, the long-term goal and purpose and desire that we have. God says, I do not want the death of the evildoer. We said this on Yom Kippur, Ne'ilah, many, many times. I want him to do tshuva. And all the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur talk about God putting his reverence in all of his creations. V'yeda kol pa'ul ki ata pa'alto. Everyone that you created will know, God, that you created them. Yavin kol yitzor ki ata yitzarto. So, this is connected to the Parei HaChag, the diminution of evil as we approach the Messianic era. And if you raise the question, how can I talk about the evil getting diminished when it seems to rise up? So the Meforshim all tell us that it's like a candle. Right before a candle goes out, there's a final burst of energy. In fact, sometimes even a human being who dies is that way. A final convulsion. We are seeing the death throes of this reshut that is going to have its final destruction. And the fact that it intensifies is not a sign of vibrancy. It is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of this is the last gasp. We don't know how long that last gasp could be, and that's part of our challenge and part of our struggle and part of our difficulty. But it is the last gasp, although it may be much longer than we would be fully comfortable with. So that's one idea. But let me point out that the Vilna Gaon has an extraordinary observation about the 70 nations. He says 35 of those 70 nations come from Ishmael, and 35 of those 70 nations come from Esau. So everything that's against us is either Ishmael or Esau. Let's flesh that out a little bit. What does the Vilna Gaon mean when he says 35 are from Esau and 35 are Ishmael? He certainly does not mean 35 are descended from Esau and 35 are descended from Ishmael. In point of fact, none of the 70 nations are descended from Esau or Ishmael. Remember, Esau and Ishmael are descendants of Avraham. The 70 nations are those besides the children of Avraham. So really there are 72 nations, Esau and Ishmael are, right? So what does he mean? The 70 nations are from Cham and from Yefes and even from Shem, other Semitic people, but not in the Abrahamic line. So what does that mean? What do you mean 35 are from Esau and 35 are from Ishmael? So the Vilna Gaon must obviously mean it is not that the nations are physically descended from Esau and Ishmael, but it means 35 nations have a spiritual essence that emanates from Esau, a spiritual essence, and 35 nations have a spiritual essence that emanates from Ishmael. What is the nature of that spiritual essence? I would suggest, in explaining the Vilna Gaon, that this refers to the two different challenges that Jewish people face in their confrontation with the nations of the world. Esau, represents what you might call hedonistic materialism. The notion that there is no need for a God. God is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is power, money, mastery, ego, control. Remember that when Esau was willing to sell the privilege of the birthright, which was a spiritual task, to Yaakov for a bowl of lentil soup, Esau said the infamous words, Hine anochi holech lamut. Behold, I'm going to die. Lama ze li bechora. Why do I need a birthright? Now, the simple translation, the way most people say it, is he's just saying, I'm so hungry I'm going to die. But the deeper meaning is this. He's actually saying, there is nothing beyond this life. After death, there is oblivion. Behold, I'm going to die. What do I need the service of God for? My goal is to enjoy life. My goal is to eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow, we shall die. So Esau, in whatever incarnation it has represents a celebration of material decadence, hedonism, money, power, ego, in which God is banished from the picture. Now, that itself can take many forms. Sometimes it can be the ego and the power lust that results in a Holocaust in which we physically get destroyed. And sometimes it could be the challenges of Western civilization, of decadence and materialism. In other words, it can take different forms, but the common denominator is, it is a power lust and a hedonistic lust, a lust for materialism, for pleasure, for power, for control, which can either get me in terms of threatening my physical survival, or I could fall prey to that very nisayon, in which I live a life of materialism, even if I'm from, right? I live a life in which I'm looking at, money and power and acquisition as the main thing of my life. Some people say sometimes the problem of the modern Orthodox Jew, I don't mean modern Orthodox as a specialized noun, I just mean the 21st century Jew, even if they're religious, is they sometimes look at the mitzvot as 613 problems they got to get around. Meaning, instead of saying, this is my life is what I want to do, but I got these mitzvot I got to work around in various ways. So, Esav is the challenge of living a life devoted to the material and not to the spiritual. When we look at the challenge of Ishmael, we see a very, very different type of idea. First of all, Ishmael, has been pointed out, is the only one of our adversaries that has the name of God in their name. Yisrael is us, Yishmael. And it is said that Yishmael, in some ways, has a dark spiritual energy. Just like physicists say, there is matter and antimatter. There is something called dark spiritual energy. Yishmael, it is said, has a certain power of prayer that God responds to in some ways. It's been pointed out that they pray 5 times a day, and we only do that on Yom Kippur, although their prayer service is short. They have circumcision. They have certain zechuyot in a perverse way. So unlike the Esav that creates a life that is minutak from godliness, in which God is simply ignored or disregarded, Yishmael is a besmirching of godliness, in which God is claimed and then co-opted for immoral and evil impulses. In fact, it's no accident that technically the excuse of this Hamas terrorism, this thing is called Al-Aqsa, meaning they're connecting it somehow to some imaginary desecration of the Temple Mount. In other words, they come up with some religious, granted it's totally fraudulent, but that's how they mobilize people, by calling upon God. That's why suicide bombers, are martyrs that go to heaven, whatever it would be. So the difference would be that the challenge of the Esavs of the world is to create the ethic of hedonistic materialism. The challenge of the Ishmaels of the world is religious fanaticism that uses God for corrupt and immoral ways. And when the Vilna Gaon says 35 are from Esav, 35 from Ishmael, he's actually teaching us that we're going to face those 2 challenges. And those are the 2 challenges we are facing. We're facing the hedonism of Western civilization, and we're facing the religious fanaticism of Islamic fundamentalism. Right? The Ishmael and the Esav are hitting us in both directions. Now, what's interesting is, Rabbeinu Bechaya says that this notion of Yishmael and Esav kind of being the spiritual sources of our enmities can be seen in another ritual of Sukkot besides the bulls, and that is the Nisuch Hamayim, Now you'll remember that during the year, when the morning sacrifice was brought every day, they would pour wine on the altar. On Sukkot, we also pour wine on the altar, but we augment the pouring of the wine with the pouring of the water. There's water and wine separately that are poured on the Mizbeach. And in fact, they would draw the water from the Shiluach, the crack of dawn, and the preceding evening would be the great, great parties in anticipation of that event that were called and are called to this day as a commemoration, Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the joy of the drawing of the water. And Chazal say, he who did not experience the joy of the drawing of the water did not experience joy in his lifetime. So today, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we don't have the actual drawing of the water, but we have Sukkos get-togethers that are still called to this day, Simchat Beit HaShoeva. In fact, the Talmud says, there's a bit of a pun here. Shoeva means drawing. You're drawing water, but it also means you're drawing divine inspiration, divine prophecy. The Talmud Yerushalmi says that Yonah the Navi, Yonah the prophet, didn't want to be a prophet. That's why he didn't want the job that God gave him. But he became a prophet because he was so happy in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, he got zapped with divine inspiration. So be careful. You lose yourself in Simcha, you never know what might happen. So here's what Rabbeinu Bechaya says. He says that when David HaMelech in the book of Tehillim talks about the suffering of the Jewish people, he sees with a prophetic eye all that we're going to go through. He says, Banu ba'eshu v'mayim, we have gone through fire and water because of your name. So says Rabbeinu Bechaya, fire refers to the persecutions of Esau, and water refers to the persecutions of Ishmael. And once again, it is a remez that it is Esau and Ishmael that are the ones that are the primary destructive forces in our lives in the ways that I explained it. So Rabbeinu Bechaya says very beautifully, since Esau is described as fire, and fire generally has a reddish color, the pouring of the wine on the altar represents the eventual tshuva of Esau that will come back to God. And on Sukkot, the pouring of the water on the altar represents the eventual return of Ishmael, fire and water. So whether you view it in terms of the parim, the 70 bulls, 35, whose power gets diminished, or whether you view it in terms of the wine and the water, which is Eish and Mayim, which is Esau and Ishmael, you see that the one takeaway from Sukkot, among many, many takeaways, is the eventual defeat of the powers of Esau and Ishmael, but not necessarily by their physical destruction, but by their returning to God and being reunited in the Beit HaMikdash, Ki Beiti, Beit Tfilah, Yikarei L'chol Ha'amim. Okay, so this is, again, going back a little bit, talking about Sukkot, but I think it is very, very relevant in terms of what we're going through. So now I want to take this analysis a little further. And that is, when we talk about an enemy outside of us that's threatening us, there's a well-known fundamental idea that which is outside of me can have power over me only if there's something within me that resembles that negative force. Meaning, the Amalek, although we're not talking about Amalek per se, but Amalek outside can get me only because there's an Amalek inside of me. When there's no Amalek inside of me, then the Amalek outside has no power. It's an illusion. It vanishes. So, if, as the Vilna Gaon teaches, we have 35 nations of Esau and 35 nations of Ishmael that have power over us, That's because there is something of the Esau within us, and there is something of the Ishmael within us. And we have to eradicate the Esau and the Ishmael within us in order to successfully eradicate the negativities of the Esau and the Ishmael outside of us. So what would this mean? If we've identified Esau as hedonism, pleasure-seeking, materialism, rendering God, even if you formally believe in him, kind of an irrelevance in your life, then that would translate in a lack of passion in serving God. So even if I do mitzvot, if I look at the Torah as a burden, if I look at the Torah as something I'd rather not be involved in, if I look at mitzvot as a bother, if I'm complacent, if I'm indifferent, if the pleasure and materialism of the world is more significant to me than serving God, then that's the Esau voice within me that's talking. Hinei anochi holech lamos, behold, I'm going to die. Lama lezeh b'chara, why do I need this burden? So, if our job is to eradicate the Esau, I must strengthen my passion to serve God, to learn Torah, to do mitzvos, to have enthusiasm, to look at Yiddishkeit as a privilege and not a burden. That's how I fight the Esau in me that's pulling me the other way. But what is the Ishmael in me? The Ishmael in me is when I believe in God, but I use my faith in God to disparage, to denigrate, to demonize, to delegitimate others. Now again, I have to be very, very, very careful here. And I may not be able to escape the hate mail or whatever it is. I'm going to utter a criticism of our religious world, but and say that there's an aspect of Ishmael in it, but I do want to make 1,000,000% clear that I'm not drawing, God forbid, a moral equivalence between what we are sometimes guilty of and the atrocities that are being perpetrated. I am not suggesting equivalence, and no one listening should make any assumption of equivalence. But I am suggesting that there's a little bit of the Ishmael within us that makes us vulnerable to the Ishmael out there. And that is when we have a lack of Avat Yisrael, not loving our fellow Jew, delegitimating, demonizing, saying anyone to the right of me is a fanatic, anyone to the left of me is an apikoros. It's only where I am. And I try to give myself a moral superiority that I am the right servant of God and you're not. That's the voice of Ishmael that's speaking. And that makes us vulnerable many, 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 many times over to those who make the same claim against us. So, if the challenge of Esau, to fight Esau, is to be menatek, remove ourselves from materialism and hedonism, the challenge of fighting Ishmael is to embrace our fellow Jew, religious or not, with love, with care, with concern, with Avat Yisrael. You know, the war has overshadowed everything else, but if you just think back a few weeks ago, we were going through a very long period of time in which there was constant fighting, bickering, attacks. Sometimes it came from the religious, who were demonstrating and blocking traffic over draft laws and the like. And other times it came from the secular against the religious, fighting the judicial reform proposals, which I can tell you as a lawyer were perfectly reasonable reforms, whatever it would be. But it was, and also the religious had nothing to do with it actually, so it was a very, very strange situation, but somehow the religious community was singled out as trying to destroy Israel as a democracy. And then we had on Yom Kippur, where a religious group wanted to have, I was holding a service with a mechitza outside. And there were people who attacked them on Yom Kippur. Again, my point is not to cast blame, because yes, there's blame on both sides here. Not in that case, but overall. There are times that religious have attacked secular. Yeah, and that's wrong. And there are times that secular have attacked religious. And that's wrong. I will be an equal opportunity condemner. I will condemn both. In fact, if in Tel Aviv there had been a mixed service, and some from people would want to have stopped that, I would have condemned it too. So I'm not simply condemning what happened on Yom Kippur because it was non-religious people attacking a religious service. I would absolutely condemn it the other way. The point is, we fight and we fight and we fight and we argue. Well, argument is okay, because obviously there are different views, different beliefs. I'm not suggesting every view is equally true, and we need to be able to debate, we need to be able to discuss. But to demonize, to hate, to simply denigrate, we do it week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. That I know what God wants and you don't. I am keeping Judaism and you're not. And now we can see, I hope we can see, kind of how stupid that was, how insignificant that was, how unimportant that was. Do you think Hamas cared if somebody was Haredi or Chiloni or whatever it is? Did it make a difference? The hostages that were taken, the soldiers that were killed. One thing that a war like this makes us realize is how insignificant are the things that divide us. That doesn't mean, again, that people shouldn't stand up and articulate their beliefs and discuss them and even argue. Argument per se, the word machlokas is the common phrase we use for every discussion in the Gemara, is a machlokas. Machlokas, Rashi and Tosfos, Machlokas, Rambam and Tur, Machlokas, Rabbi Yasser of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, sure. Judaism is about Machlokas, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, at least. That's our tradition. That's how we learn Torah, that's how we grow. I'm not critical of that. Obviously, I'm not critical of that. But the notion that everybody gets demonized. And this reminds us how much more there is that unites us than separates us. And when we demonize, we're not really speaking as Jews, we're speaking as Ishmaels, in which the midah of Ishmael is within us like a cancer that's leading us astray. So these are the things, we have to learn. Obviously, the basic approach, once again, are relatively simple. There's a book, a secular book, and I don't mean to trivialize, but it says, everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten. In many, many ways, which, there's a lot of truth to that, actually. In many, many ways, we don't need to be super sophisticated. We don't need to be hyper subtle. We don't need to come up with fancy, highfalutin formulas or quick fixes. Everyone else wants a quick fix. What if I go to Kever Rachel and walk around it 110 times with a red thread? These are not the things that really work. The things that help us through life: prayer, turning to God; charity; Avat Yisrael, loving our fellow Jew; gratitude. Gratitude, can you imagine what our chayolim are going through now? And how much they're suffering. And many have already made the ultimate sacrifice, but how much their families are suffering. Religious, non-religious. Look at what they're giving for the Jewish people, for Eretz Yisrael. We can debate. should yeshiva guys be drafted? No, this is a legitimate debate. I'm not suggesting throwing in the towel on anything. One can debate, one can discuss, one can disagree. But how can we deny hakarat hatov? And you know, there's a pasuk in Mishael that I quote many, many, many times. So forgive me, you may have heard it 10 times already over the years, maybe more than that. But I think it's a motto that people should put on their refrigerators. King Solomon, Shlomo Melech says, Kamayim hapanim el panim, kain lev ha'adam li adam. As water reflects the face that you show the water, so too the heart of man reflects that which is shown. What does that mean? I look at a reflecting pool of water. The face that I show the water is the face I will see in the water. I smile at the water. I see a smiling face, my face. I frown at the water. I see an angry face. So too, the respect that I show you will be mirrored back to me. If a religious Jew can show hakarat hatov for the good that people do, then they too will see the good that religious people do. Now again, religious people, that's a very wide swath. Obviously there are many, many religious soldiers in the army itself. But even those who are not in the army, we believe, if you're a believer, that Torah, mitzvos, tefillah bring down spiritual blessing. But people who are not connected so much to Judaism don't always see that. But if we would have hakarat hatov for their contribution, they would also have hakarat hatov for the other side, the other contributions that are being made. Right? So these are things we have to learn. And unfortunately, it sometimes takes these great, great, great tragedies to make us pay attention to what we should have known all along. That we have to be one. We have to be together. We have to love each other. We have to care about each other. And together we turn to God. From asking Him for Yeshua, for salvation, for mercy, for rachamim, so the deaths will stop and the destruction will stop. And even the nations of the world will come to tshuva and turn to Hashem. And then His holy presence will be revealed once again in Yerushalayim. And the Beis HaMikdash will become the Beit Tefillah Yikarei L'chol Ha'amim, the house of prayer for all of the nations of the world. May we be zocheh to this very, very, very soon. B'mei Rabbi Yameinu. Amen.